Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to present the findings and recommendations we prepared for the city regarding parking in the Crossroads District. The purpose of the study was to develop a long-range parking strategy to positively support and balance the parking needs and wants of Crossroads residents and businesses. With that in mind, the scope of services was developed, and that included looking at current parking needs, doing some community engagement, projecting future parking needs, doing a policy review. All of those fed into an alternatives analysis and plan development, and ultimately to a parking strategy. The first piece was the current parking needs, and we did a significant amount of field work for that. We looked at parking supply and performed an inventory of spaces. We looked at both on-street and off-street. We looked at public and private within the off-street, and we also looked at any user restrictions for the on-street and the off-street spaces. What we found for the parking inventory was that there was roughly 9,800 total spaces within the Crossroads. That included an on-street supply of over 1,600 spaces, a publicly available 24/7 off-street supply of just under 2,300 spaces, some spaces that are available to the public in the evenings and on weekends. There's 835 of those. And then the largest portion, 51%, is actually off-street private parking supply. We also looked at parking occupancy, and the heat map to the left shows the overall parking within each of the blocks, and it goes from 0 to 70% is occupied is green. From 70 to 84% is yellow, and 85% and above is red. So as you can see, there are a few blocks where we have parking occupancy above 85%, and the map to the right, that looks at only the on-street parking. So that kind of pulls it out as a separate piece so we can see how that parking supply is being used. And so 12 p.m. ended up being our peak period. We looked at 12, 5 p.m., and then midnight. And the overall peak was 50% occupied. During that peak period, looking at only the on-street, that was 72% occupied. We looked at 5 p.m., and at 5 p.m. you can see that there are no longer any blocks that are above 85%, but we still do have some on-street that is above 85%. The overall was down at 29% occupied, and the on-street was at 59%. Then we looked at midnight, and midnight, nothing was above 69%. No total blocks were above 69%. And so with that, we see that the parking demand definitely drops off throughout the course of the day. Also for the on-street, there's a few blocks that still do have a high occupancy. Some of those are located nearer to businesses that are open in the evening, or to some of the residential that is south of 20th. Looking at it graphically, we see the green column is the total overall, so you can see that it does drop off pretty steadily. And the orange is the on-street parking. That kind of maintained well between noon and 5 p.m., but then it did drop off. And both the off-street public 24/7 and evenings and weekends, both of those went down fairly quickly as well. And the off-street private did drop, but just not as quickly as some of the other parking supply. Looking at community engagement, we performed online surveys as well as performing some focus groups. So for the online surveys, we were able to get some good qualitative information and about user experiences, user preferences, and it's a good baseline for feedback if there is another online survey that the city would like to perform later on. Some of the key findings from that, we saw that 69% of the respondents come to the Crossroads at least weekly. Lunchtime and after 5 p.m. are the most common times to visit. 42% of respondents stay 1 to 3 hours. And respondents decided where to park based on distance of the parking regulations and then ease of access. 60% of respondents prefer on-street parking. And then one of the things that we kind of keyed in on here is 85% of the respondents typically park within 2 blocks of their destination. So right now, most people are able to find parking near their destination. And then 60% of respondents reported search for parking fewer than 5 minutes. So from the online survey, that's the information that was the key takeaways. From the focus groups involved a diverse user group. We had business owners, developers, folks from the community living in the community, and some of the employees of the restaurants and retail and offices that are there as well. So within the focus group, we were able to ask questions, listen, and engage a little bit more than the online survey, and it allowed for a little bit more of sharing of ideas, some collaboration, and we ended up having some good solution-oriented discussion. Within that, kind of the key takeaways were there's a need for active enforcement of existing regulations. We need to improve first-time user experience through improved messaging. Improving walkability with safe, accessible pedestrian infrastructure was a request. And then implementing a system-wide centralized solution for management of parking resources, both the publicly owned and privately owned resources. Moving on to the future parking needs, we started off with information that we were able to gather from the city and from local developers regarding any plan development and looking at any of the vacancies that were there when we performed our field work to get current parking conditions. That information was run through a shared parking analysis, and in order to do that, we needed to kind of put things, consider a reasonable walking distance. And so we divided the total study area into zones, and those are the lettered zones that you see in the map to the left. And once we had that, we could take into account some of the efficiencies that are there between some of the land uses. And so that information was put into our model, and from there we ended up running it through. And the shared parking model takes into account how land uses actually generate parking throughout the course of the day and the course of the year. And so it is a model where you can kind of pull out different time frames, and that's what we did when we looked at the future parking demand. So it pushed out basically graphs that show kind of stacked activity and how much parking would be generated by different user groups. And then that provided us with information about the plan development and the filled vacancies that we'd assume would be the case in the future. We also wanted to take into account something called organic growth. And organic growth is typically, it's an intensification of use, and that's through a change in land use type, change in tenant, more employees per square foot, or popularity of a destination. Basically, it assumes the same amount of square footage is there, it's just being used differently. And so we wanted to account for that as well. Now, feedback that we'd received both from the city and from the development community suggested a pretty significant range So we wanted to make sure that we tested a few different scenarios. So we put together a base scenario that assumes no increase off of the current parking demand. And then we also ran 3 other scenarios looking at 5%, 15%, and 25% increase over the current. What we looked at, though, was really, how would it likely look? And so we wanted to think about what the potential maximum is with this 5-year projection period that we were tasked to look at. So we looked at the 15% organic growth as being the highest likely within the next 5 years. And looking at the future change, so the planned developments and vacancies, plus the 15% organic growth, we rolled up into a 77% occupancy for the study area. And obviously, different blocks are showing occupancy above 85%, and this is at the peak period. Now, it's interesting, though, because it's still 77% overall. And when you look at how it's broken down, there are definitely some hot spots within some of the zones down to the right. But there's also pretty significant occupancy, pretty significant availability within some of the other zones. And so it's a question of maybe locating or relocating where people are parking and making sure that they're accommodated, but potentially shifting them. So that's for the 12 p.m. period, and that's the peak. Next is looking at the 5 p.m., and you can see that there's less red, a little bit more green, and there's some yellow on the heat map now. So things start to subside a bit. Obviously down in Zone G, which is the area south of Southwest Boulevard and south of 20th and west of Main. That area still has a pretty significant amount of demand based on some other developments that are potentially going in. At midnight, again, most of these have turned over to green. There are some areas that still have a projected parking shortfall, but overall in the study area, we're looking at a 36% occupancy. So even the shortfalls that are identified within some of the localities, there is some availability throughout the overall study area. So it's a question of potentially moving those people to available supply. So in summary, we had the peak period at noon was at 77%, the 5 p.m. period was at 57%, and the midnight period was at 36%. And so obviously the parking supply within the area is significant enough to provide adequate parking for everyone. It's just a question of making sure that it's available for them and shifting those users. So a summary of the conditions for the first 5 years, looking out 5 years, current to 5 years out. There's an imbalance of use for on-street and off-street parking. Most users prefer on-street. Long-term parkers are parked in the on-street right now. On-street is full during the peak while off-street is available. On-street enforcement is believed to be lacking, and then localized shortfalls, especially for on-street, were observed. There's an imbalance also between daytime and nighttime needs. So land uses generate significantly more daytime parking and activity versus nighttime. Significant availability at night, especially in the off-street parking. And so that's something that could be taken advantage of. Some user concerns about safety at night as well. There's an imbalance in location of publicly available parking. The on-street parking, Arts District Garage, and the surface lot to be replaced by the Convention Hotel, and the Corrigan Station Garage, only available nights and weekends. That's the municipal supply. So that's actually fairly limited right now. And with it being as limited as it is, the location of most of that supply ends up being split between the Arts District Garage and Corrigan Station in the nights and evenings. Sorry, nights and weekends. There's also a local cultural barrier to distance. That was something discussed within the focus groups, and we heard in the feedback as well. You know, people are not used to walking a block or two. Typically, they're hoping to park adjacent to or in front of their destination. Also, there's infrastructure and signage, and wayfinding that needs improvement in order to help out with how that's located, where the parking is located, and how people feel about the distance they may have to walk. And then publicly available parking needs to be more obvious and proximate to meet user needs. So that goes back to some of the signage. So some of the private supply that is publicly available, maybe improving some signage there. Reasonable projections for the next 5 years suggest total occupancy between 70 and 77%. So aside from policies and programs to shift parking demand, additional supply will likely be needed as development continues beyond 5 years, because the 5-year period that we looked at, most developers were looking to develop sites that had limited parking on them as far as what was being displaced. And so over time, as surface lots are developed, we're losing supply and increasing the amount of demand. And so that's something where additional parking supply is going to be needed and likely in a structured setting. And so it's important for the city to define the role regarding parking development of the future parking supply. Now, looking at policy review, we'll kind of just hop through this very quickly. There are 6 different categories that we looked at within policy review. So within the planning code, kind of the takeaway is that within the study area, the minimum parking requirements are reduced from typical city standards for a few different reasons. Next, looking at the on-street policy. Currently, there are many different restrictions for on-street parking. And there's also a discussion of enforcement being more proactive moving forward as enforcement moves away from KCPD and back into parking services. Within the off-street policy, we found that the lack of on-street enforcement and the confusing or lacking signage contribute to some of the low off-street usage. And then shared parking agreements for private lots. Although it's encouraged, some owners are wary or uninterested for various reasons in sharing their parking with others. Within the infrastructure and programs, there are many multimodal transportation options available within the Crossroads. And we found that a TDM strategy, or transportation demand management strategy or program, is needed to realize the benefits of that infrastructure, the multimodal transportation that's been made available. And also, additional streetscape improvements are needed for pedestrians within some of the blocks of the study area. Looking at technology, there's a lot of useful technology being explored and implemented to improve parking management and enforcement. New parking enforcement will include the latest tech for a more efficient system. So looking at it for both the end users and efficiencies for the actual enforcement personnel. And then the city's actually they're actively exploring a public interface to provide parking information to the public. So looking at potentially an app, also some options for online resources. And then lastly, looking at organizational structure. Historically, the organizational structure has been set up with parking services with minimal city staff, basically as administration and coordination of contract services. Those contract services have performance metrics that are looked at by city staff to make sure that the contractors are in line with the services that they should be providing. There's a limited city staff, and so that creates a challenge, especially when there's a large event, because day-to-day operations still need to occur, but the event needs to be coordinated as well, and so that can sometimes create a strain. Historically, the position of the city is only to provide parking when and where it's needed, but there may be a shift in that thinking. Recent discussions have suggested that the organizational structure, a change to the organizational structure may be appropriate. So there may be some additional need for some staffing in order to move forward with some of the goals of the city. Looking at the alternatives analysis and developing a plan, we typically run things through a bit of a decision tree. And first, we identify whether, where, and the severity of any kind of a parking shortfall. And then we figure out whether it's localized or if it's systemic. So if it's just little pockets here or there, or if overall the study area has a parking problem. And then once that's identified, we try to figure out whether we can develop parking management policies or programs for localized. And if that will correct it, then we develop those programs and strategies. If not, we identify cost-effective ways to provide additional parking supply. And then similarly, with a systemic shortfall, we look at transportation demand management policies and programs and whether those can be boosted up to alleviate the parking shortfall. And if we can, then we help to guide and create those strategies. If not, we again look at identifying cost-effective ways to provide additional parking supply. So within the recommendations, keep in mind that these are recommendations to the city. The city can choose how they would like to move forward with them. But this is just looking at the inputs that we have as well as industry best practice and trying to come up with solutions for a parking strategy. So within that, in the planning strategy, we wanted to encourage multimodal through code, because right now just shifting away from having the full minimum parking requirement, the only thing that means is they're not developers and business owners are not required to provide the parking, but there isn't necessarily a push to shift people to these other multimodal options. So the streetcar, the Max bus, other bus, regular bus network, the B-cycle, and zip car. All of these are options that people can use, but there isn't really anything that's pushing. There's no longer a requirement on the parking, but there's nothing pushing them to these other options. We also have some recommendations that suggest parking credits or parking in lieu fees. So if those minimum parking requirements can't be met, and the public will have to the city would then make up for that shortfall, but this creates a funding mechanism for that, and so then it's not a tax on the public in general. And looking at some of the planning stuff right now, there isn't a large problem because of the amount of development that's happening and the availability of surface parking. But the reason why we make these recommendations is when you're talking about strategy, there is a long-term view that needs to be considered. Looking at the on-street parking strategy, we're looking at adding metered parking with no time limit along Main, along Baltimore, and along either Grand or Oak, and that would help to balance out some of the parking supply. It means that some of the people who are parking on street now, who park for long periods, they may still actually need they may need parking near to them that is not time restricted, and so we want to make sure that that's an option. And these streets right now are well, Main is something where you want to make sure that there's good turnover for the businesses that are there. For Baltimore, it's a considerably large parking supply based on the fact that there's angled parking, and we're also, and that'll be in the next slide or two, but looking at changing some of the infrastructure on Grand or Oak and putting in angled parking to increase the parking supply. And that way you have kind of a balanced parking supply that has no time limit, but it does have some economics involved there to encourage turnover. The remainder of the north-south streets would be 3-hour time limit, matching what's there now in this area, the Crossroads. And then we also wanted to include some areas for those employees who are economically not making the same as some of the others in the area, but are really a needed resource. So we're talking about some of the servers who maybe don't work full-time. We're talking about busing staff, cleaning staff for some of the buildings. And so we want to make sure that there are spaces available for those folks. So in concept, we decided to say, well, based on the amount of space that we believe that they would need, we are looking at a 10-hour time limit for the south side of 18th and 20th Streets. Obviously, that is something, there's other options, but we just wanted to keep in mind that user group. And then looking at the rest of the east-west streets, a 3-hour time limit. And then within the entire study area, it was noted that there are plenty of people who do need to have approximate place to put their car while they're loading or unloading. And so looking at 15-minute loading zones as needed to make sure that people who have to park a block or two away have a place to load and unload their vehicle and then go park it off-site. Within the off-street, looking at the parking strategy there, we want to encourage an interdepartmental mechanism between planning and economic development and then parking services to help locate public parking for sites that have a deficit, because right now there's pretty good availability within the Arts District garage, but there isn't necessarily anything that's pushing people to that garage. And so identifying as these developments come online the need, and then helping that need be fulfilled is important for the off-street. Also improving signage to communicate where public parking is located and where it's available. So looking at wayfinding and also monument signage potentially to tell how many spaces are available, where those are located. And that's something that could even be included when we're talking about the on-street supply, especially where we're putting in the angled parking and paid parking. Also within the off-street supply, we want to recommend a shared parking district. And basically that helps because it increases the pool of publicly available private parking. And so there are some steps that can be taken to make that happen. Also looking at infrastructure and programs, one of the things that we looked at specifically was the fact that the Arts District garage kind of has a limited catchment area based on how far people are willing to walk. So within that, we said, well, how do we get that supply closer to people? Because you can't actually move the garage. How do we improve the influence that it has? And so we looked at a neighborhood circulator that would run the route here in yellow, and basically it takes anybody within 2 blocks of their destination from this garage. Now in time, obviously the Arts District garage would get closer to being full, and so it would be a good idea to identify a location kind of opposite that, or just anywhere along that route that would then allow for more parking supply to meet the needs within the Crossroads as well. So we'd want to utilize the existing right-of-way to improve parking and pedestrian and bike infrastructure. That's one of the key takeaways from our recommendations. And then paid parking would also help to fund some of the local system. So it's something that could be put back into some of the infrastructure improvements. It could be something that could be put into the circulator, or back into offsetting operations costs for the parking as well. And then again, talking about the neighborhood circulator, it effectively brings larger parking supply to more people. Enforcement. Enforcement is kind of the key to bringing it all together, because without it, people don't follow policy, and that's something I think that we can all acknowledge is happening now. And so improving the efficiency is very important. So targeting when staffing is where they're located and when they're there. Improving the technology, so looking at some other tools to help with enforcement. Specifically the one here, this is a license plate enabled parking system. And then also looking at occasional enforcement blitzes. Another piece that can help with this is revising the fine strategy. So looking at graduated fines and penalties. So maybe the first offense, first parking ticket you get is a warning, and then the next you actually do have a fine or a penalty, and then it actually could potentially double for the second one and go up even further for a third and further. And that helps to end the people who are habitually not following policy, which has a big impact on parking. So within a license plate enabled system, typically it's vehicle mounted, similar to what you see here. There's a tough book that's in the vehicle, and it runs software that does license plate recognition and would help with identifying vehicles that are habitual offenders. And then basically it kicks it out into a software program, and you can run all different types of things with this. You can look at time restrictions, permit zones, and paid parking, all with this equipment. So key takeaway here is the enforcement makes it all work, and it's important to improve efficiency to keep costs down, and staffing is typically the #1 cost, and so using technology can help to limit the amount of staffing that's required, or help shift it to the most appropriate places. And then revising the fine schedule will help improve compliance. Technology. We want to make sure that we improve the capability to provide parking availability information to the public. And right now, there's a bit of a challenge looking at the back-end tech needed to support the effort. So the rollout to move that forward should be strategic to leverage the costs and benefits. The parking system structure, one of the things that we've recommended is looking at potentially moving to a parking authority. And the parking authority would be responsible for parking management, maintenance, enforcement, but also the financial piece of it. And so they would be held accountable to keeping parking in the black and making sure that it's self-sustaining. Also, there would be greater autonomy for some of the policy setting and responsiveness for parking management needs. We also recommended looking at a TMO, Transportation Management Association or administration, and that is a quasi-governmental agency that would help kind of bring together all of the different forms of transportation and access for the area, and help to balance those better. And they could also be in charge of looking at the TDM strategy for the city and helping to market that. Long-term parking strategies. So one of the things that we were asked to take a look at is beyond the 5 years, how do things look? And so we wanted to consider, the city should consider strategic purchase of land for use as parking. Also consider development of parking stages. So looking at some of those pieces of land and developing surface lots, and then looking at good ways to use that, where it's potentially wrapped by other land uses to keep the character of the area, or built in a way that can be converted to a non-parking use for the future. And then potentially there's the option of for eventual sale of the site if it's no longer serving the public as parking. So if you do a conversion, and then you can actually sell it off. And so on the opposite side of that is looking at strategic partnerships with private developers to add public parking if and where it improves access to the area for the public. And so maybe adding 100 spaces to a parking garage and offsetting that through public funds.